we have this first example where we have the unit circle drawn, and we need to figure out what the value of the y-coordinate of point A is. And remember from above that the x and y coordinates are just the cosine of the angle and the sine of the angle. So essentially we want the y-coordinate of point A, so we're going to have to deal with the sine of theta. But when dealing with the unit circle, theta is measured from the positive x-axis. So essentially we need to know what is this angle, and once we figure out that angle, we can plug it in here for the sine of theta. And like I mentioned above, since this angle and this angle here essentially form the angles of a line, we know that they're supplementary. So essentially we can take 180 degrees and just subtract off 15, and that'll tell us what theta is. And so theta in this case is 165 degrees. So if we evaluate the sine of 165 degrees, we can figure out exactly what the y-coordinate of point A is. And when you actually evaluate this into the calculator, what you get is 0.2588. So 0.2588. And one thing to notice is that the sine and the cosine at most can be equal to 1, and at their minimum will be equal to -1. Since if you think about it, you can look at essentially the extreme cases of each triangle. So you can imagine us having a triangle where it's essentially flat. So in this case, it essentially has no y-coordinate. Its y-coordinate is equal to 0. So it's a flat triangle where the x-coordinate and the hypotenuse are then equal to 1. So this is kind of the maximum x value. And you can look at a similar situation to find the maximum y value. So this is again a completely flat triangle, but now it's completely vertical. So in this case, the x-coordinate is 0, and the triangle is essentially all the y value. And since the hypotenuse is 1, the y value is also equal to 1. But we could also look at essentially the negative cases. So this case down here is where we essentially have a y value of -1, so that would be the maximum negative y value. And for our x values, we can look at this extreme case here. And over here, the x value is essentially at its maximum negative value, and that would be at -1. So these are the extreme cases, but what we can do is generalize and say that the sine of theta is always between 1 and -1, and it's also true for the cosine of theta. That is also between 1 and -1. So you should never get values for the sine or the cosine of whatever angle you have that are greater than 1. So this value makes some sense, and it does seem like that compared to a y value of 1, that this is about 1/4 of that. So this answer does make sense relative to the picture. So let's look at a second example now. And this time we want to know what the x-coordinate of point A is. And remember that the x-coordinate is the cosine of the angle, where the y is the sine of the angle. And again, we're measuring the angle from the positive x-axis. So we know that from the x-axis to the y-axis that we have 90 degrees, and then we're just adding 20 more degrees. So this big angle here would just be 110 degrees. So we can calculate the cosine of 110 degrees, and we should expect some negative x value, because if we drop this down, essentially this is our x value here, so it should be negative, and it should be maybe around 0.3, so maybe -0.3, though that's just a rough guess. So let's now plug it into the calculator and see what we get. And what you find is that the cosine of 110 degrees is equal to -0.342. So our guess of -0.3 was fairly close, but it's good to guess like that, because that way when you get an answer, it should be reasonably close to what you guessed. Now if we got an answer of like -0.8, then that probably is telling us that we're doing something wrong, because -0.8 would be somewhere over here. So now let's look at one final example here. And we have these points A, B, and C on the unit circle. And we need to know which of the coordinates is equal to the cosine of 160 degrees. So that's what we're trying to find, the cosine of 160. We need to know which of these points has a cosine of 160, and then is that the x or the y value? And we know that the cosine is dealing specifically with x values. And then the angle of 160 degrees, remember, we're measuring from the positive x-axis. And if we go all the way to here, this would be 180. So it's a little bit shorter than that. So that tells us that it looks like we're going to point B here. So let me just draw that line in. So this angle from the positive x-axis to this line that connects to point B, this is our 160 degrees. So the cosine of 160 here is simply the x-coordinate of point B.